All right, now, as I promised and discussed, here are the answers for the FRQ portion that was on the test. I apologize to those of you who actually did the questions and they're not counting, especially if you did well on them. However, it was very clear that enough of you were either copying or collaborating that it made it kind of useless, really, as an assessment instrument. And really wasn't something to take as a grade. But I want to be able to go through these and show you what the right answers are. And so this way you can also look at your own answers, especially if you did them, and you can determine what the scoring would have been, what mistakes you made. All right. So we're going to start off with this one. This was the first one. The city of Rapture is in a recession. So the first question, what is one monetary policy that action that Rapture's central bank could take to could employ to address this concern? Okay. Let me do not disturb. There we go. All right. Now the answer to this. Let me see if I can get this in red here. Layout format. I don't have my usual toolbars up here. Red. Okay. Now it's asking for a specific monetary policy action. Now what this means is, if you said merely expansionary monetary policy, that doesn't count. All right, and I word these in such a way that they get worded this way on the actual AP test. This is how they word the FRQs. And they will ask things like this, right? Name a monetary policy action or name a fiscal policy action. They're not looking for you to say expansionary or contractionary. They want an action. Okay, so with monetary policy action, there were three different things you could say. Any one of them would have gotten you the point. You could have said lower the discount rate. You could have said lower the required reserve ratio or reserve requirement. Or you could have said buy bonds. Okay, any one of those three would have been enough to get you the point, right? Lower discount rate, lower the required reserve ratio or reserve requirement, or buy bonds, purchase bonds. Okay, those are the those are the monetary policy actions that the central bank can take. Okay. Now, how will this action affect the money market graph? What you want to say here is that the money supply will shift right. Okay. I would have given it to you if you said like the money supply curve increases. Really, I was looking for you to say that the money supply curve is going to shift to the right. A lot of people said the graph will shift to the right or the graph will shift to the left, and I don't know what that means, right? The graph is the entire thing, right? The XY with all the curves on it and numbers and dotted lines. Like you're going to say the entire thing is shifting, right, one way or another. No. We're looking for a particular line that is going to move, all right? So you had to specify it was the money supply that is going to shift, and it's going to shift to the right. Yep. Because we're increasing the money supply, which is going to be a shift right. Okay, on this one, what is one fiscal policy action that Rapture's government can employ to address the recession? Again, one action. So if we're talking about fiscal policy, it's going to be taxes or spending. Something involving one of them. If we're doing expansionary fiscal policy, because we're in a recession, then it would be lower taxes or increased spending. All right, one or the other. Either one is going to get you the point. Okay, D. How will the fiscal and or monetary policy action you identified above affect the ASAD graph? You want to say that aggregate demand will shift right. That's it. All right, because that's what's going to occur. The expansionary policy means that the aggregate demand curve will shift to the right. If you want to go further and say stuff like it'll raise price levels and raise output, you can do that. But the minimum I was looking for was you make the association that the expansionary policy is going to affect aggregate demand because it affects spending. Right? On both cases, it increases consumption, it increases investment, which therefore increases aggregate demand, which will cause it to shift to the right. Okay. E, explain how the monetary policy action you identified above will affect real interest rate on the loanable funds graph. Answer here is that the supply of loanable funds will shift right. Okay. And when the Federal Reserve is putting more money out there, it's increasing the supply of loanable funds in the loanable funds market. Remember, loanable funds is what it sounds like. It's the money that's in the banking system available to be loaned out. Okay, savings is the supply of loanable funds. Savings is the supply of loanable funds. Okay, and borrowing is the demand. When the Fed is putting more money into the system, that's loanable funds, right? They're not saving it necessarily, but all that money becomes excess reserves that is there to be loaned out. Okay, so I said this at one point, right? The supply of loanable funds and savings can also be the Fed. Okay, and then down here, if the government were to fund the fiscal policy in C through borrowing, what would the shift on the loanable funds graph and why? Answer here is the demand for loanable funds will shift right. Typed it dead. Right, the demand for loanable funds will shift right. Okay, because if the government is going to be financing it through borrowing, all right, that means that there's a bigger demand for loanable funds in the money market, loanable funds graph. So the demand will shift to the right. If you want to further say the demand will shift to the right, which will raise interest rates, dandy. All right, because that's what's happening. That is the crowding out effect. Really, this is a crowding out effect question. But what I'm looking for is not for you to tell me, oh, it's crowding out. I want you to tell me what's happening in the little loanable funds graph. That's why I specified what's happening in the loanable funds graph, right? So the loanable funds graph will shift right because the government is borrowing more money. Right. So that's the answer there, right? The second question, I gave you this setup. I actually just figured out that I made a slight error. I meant to say 30,000 here under reserves. So 3,000 really shouldn't have affected the answers, but still, that was a boo-boo on my part. Should have been 30,000 instead of 3,000. All right, so given our balance sheet here, we got 300,000 in demand deposits, $0 in owner's equity, so disregarded. Remember, we disregard owner's equity anyway. 3,000 overall reserves, although again I meant that to be 30,000. 290,000 in loans and $7,000 in bonds. The required reserve ratio is 10%. All right. So if it was 10% and we had this in demand deposits and $3,000 in reserves, that would mean that the 30,000 was the 10% of the 300,000. So that's where I made the mistake on my part. Right, I still had everything balanced, but not on purpose, really. That was, again, an accident. I should have had those numbers a little bit different. Anyway, so how much money can this bank still loan out? The answer is $0. It has no excess reserves. Remember, excess reserves is money the bank can loan out, but has not yet loaned out. So they're not even covering their required reserves right now, obviously. So they have no excess reserves, which means they can't loan out any money. So $0 is the answer there. Okay. If the Federal Reserve were to buy $5,000 worth of bonds from this bank, what would be the change on the asset side of the balance sheet? The asset side is everything that counts in favor of it. The answer is $0 again. We could have said no change. Okay. Reason being is that when the Fed buys those bonds, all right, what's going to happen here is that this will reduce from 7,000 to 2,000 because the Fed bought $5,000 worth of those bonds from this bank. So this will go from $7,000 to $2,000. All right, and then excess reserves would go up by 5,000. So overall reserves, in my mistyping, would go up to 8,000. All right. So the end result, though, on the asset side is you don't have any change because all you're doing on the asset side is reducing this number and making this one larger. All right, so the net change on the asset side is nothing. All right, C, when the Fed buys $5,000 worth of bonds from this bank, what would ultimately be the maximum change in demand deposits in the banking system as a result of this purchase? All right, so when the Fed bought the bonds, that entire $5,000 became excess reserves. All right, so what we need to do is take our money multiplier, come on, red, times the initial excess reserves will give us that amount, right? That's the additional new money that will get created, which also means we're assuming that gets redeposited into the banking system. The money multiplier is equal to 1 over the required reserve ratio, right? In this case, the required reserve ratio is 10%, so it's 1 over 0.1, which gives us a multiplier of 10. So we take 10 times the initial excess reserves of $5,000, which gives us a total of $50,000 that demand deposits would increase by in the banking system. All right, if a customer were to withdraw $1,000 cash from her checking account, what would be the immediate change in the M1 measurement? Once again, the answer is 0. All right. The $1,000 in demand deposits from the checking account, that was already in M1. So when they withdraw $1,000 from demand deposits in the form of cash, all you did was draw down $1,000 in demand deposits in the banking system in M1, and then you moved up $1,000 in cash in M1. So there was no net change overall within M1 because the $1,000 was already there. All right. E, if a customer were to deposit $2,000 into her checking account at this bank, what is the maximum possible change in the money supply that could result? All right. So what we need to do here is figure out what the initial excess reserves is going to be. Okay, so the $2,000 gets deposited, and there's a 10% reserve requirement. So 10% of $2,000 is $200. Okay, so that means that out of the overall $2,000, the bank has to keep on hand $200 and can't loan it out. That means that the remaining $800 is the initial excess reserves. All right, so we take the initial excess reserves of $1,800, multiply it by the money multiplier, which we already determined is 10, and that gives us $18,000. So the money supply could increase by a total of $18,000. Okay, and then this last one, name one thing that could result in an actual increase, in the money supply being smaller than the number calculated in D. All right. Now, we need to remind ourselves that when we're cycling through here with this whole money multiplier thing, the assumption is that all the excess reserves are getting loaned out, okay, and that all the money getting loaned out is being redeposited into the banking system. If one of those two things does not happen, then less money will get created than the maximum. So like this 18,000 right here, this is the maximum amount of money that could get created. It doesn't mean that's how much actually will. So this question, which is asking you to show that you understand those two assumptions. So what would cause the actual amount of money getting created to be less than the maximum possible? You would say either one or the other, that the not all the excess reserves are getting loaned out. Or you could have said that not all the money being loaned out is being redeposited into the banking system. All right, either one of those would have been good enough to get you the point. All right, moving on to the third one here. City of Heathwall has the following employment figures: 600,000 employed, frictionally unemployed, 150,000, structurally unemployed, 50,000, discouraged workers, 30,000, children, 50,000, retired people, 120,000. All right. Now, with a question like this, before we do other stuff, first thing we want to figure out is how many people are in the labor force and what's the total population. So the labor force here is equal to the number of people who are employed, so we got 600,000, plus the people who are unemployed. In this case, we have 150,000 who are frictionally unemployed, plus 50,000 who are structurally unemployed, and that's it. The discouraged workers, remember, they don't have jobs, but they don't count, all right, for our purposes. So they don't count as being part of the labor force. So if we add this up, 600,000 plus 150,000, that's 750,000, plus another 50,000, that gives us a labor force of 800,000 people. And then the total population, well, we'll start off with 800,000 because that took care of everybody for the first three numbers. So we'll say 800,000 plus the discouraged workers, 30,000, plus the kids, 50,000, plus the retired people, which is 120,000. You add all those up, we get a cool million people. It's almost like I gave you figures that'd be relatively easy to work with. All right, so what is the unemployment rate in Heathwall? The unemployment rate is equal to unemployed people, I'll say number of unemployed, divided by the number in the labor force. Right, and all of that times 100. Okay, so if we do that, we get the number of unemployed people was 150,000 plus 50,000. Okay, so that gives us 200,000 divided by the number of people in the labor force, 800,000 times 100. So that gives us 0.25 times 100, which is equal to 25%. Okay, the unemployment rate in Heathwall is 25%. Right, 200,000 out of 800,000, 2 out of 8, that means 25%, 1/4. Okay, what is the labor force participation rate in Heathwall? Labor force participation rate is equal to the number in labor force divided by total population times 100. So that gives us number in the labor force we already set up here, 800,000, divided by total population we said was 1 million times 100. So that is equal to 0.8 times 100 is equal to 80%. All right, which is easy, right? 800,000 out of a million, that's 80%. All right, just take some zeros off. 8 out of 10, what is that? That's 80%. All right, you don't need a calculator for this stuff. Okay, now production possibilities graph, where would the point of production be for Heathwall? If we're at 25% unemployment, which is what we determined there, then that means that we're in a recession. So you would say that it is inside the curve, right? Remember, anywhere inside the curve means we're not producing at capacity. D, if policymakers took no action to address the unemployment in Heathwall, what will classical economists argue will shift and what direction on the old ASAD graph to get us back to long-run equilibrium? The answer is SRAS will shift right. I didn't even ask you to explain. You just need to understand that it shifts right. Why? Unemployment gets bad enough, wages and prices start to become flexible, producers start to make more of a profit when they start having to pay their workers less, so they start to produce more. SRAS will shift right. All right, if the Federal Reserve were to address the unemployment in Heathwall through monetary policy, what is the name of the group that will decide on that monetary policy? It's a question about the structure of the Fed. FOMC, Federal Open Market Committee. Remember, this is the committee that's made up of all 7 of the governors on the Board of Governors, and then 12 of the regional bank presidents, one of whom is always the president of the New York Fed. If banks in Heathwall needed to borrow money to stay afloat, what is the first entity they would seek to borrow from, and at what interest rate? What's the interest rate called? The answer is other banks. They would borrow at the federal funds rate. That is the interest rate at which banks borrow from each other. And if banks cannot borrow from the entity in F, that would be other banks. What is the last entity they would seek to borrow money from, and at what interest rate? The Federal Reserve. The Fed is the lender of last resort, and they would borrow at the discount rate. Okay. So those were the answers I was looking for on all the FRQs. Like I said, I got most of the way through number 1, and I gave up when I started seeing the same verbiage, which I'm sure had happened on some of the other FRQs that we had done for tests. There are only 2 other sets that we've done so far, but a lot of those were just numbers, right, or moving graphs. So not as easy to pick out. But the common verbiage I kept seeing this time was beyond coincidence, let's say. All right, but you can use these to be able to score yourself on the FRQs and see if you got them right or wrong. And if you got things wrong, I'm hoping that this also helps to explain how it is that you were supposed to have done them correctly. Now, again, I designed these questions. I had to write these myself because I know all the other questions are already online. But I wrote them in the style of what a College Board actually does, right? Using the language that they use and asking the sort of questions that College Board likes to use a lot. So we're going to be going over some of the actual FRQs in the past in the course of our review, so we'll see how this turns out, right? As far as how they use it. All right, thanks.